Neurons are classified structurally and functionally. Now, structural classifications look at how many processes extend from the neuron soma, while functional classifications look at the direction that the action potentials travel relative to the central nervous system. So our main focus will be the structural classifications, but we'll also describe functional classifications as well. So let's look at the structural classifications. There are three types of structural classifications of neurons. There are the multipolar neurons, the bipolar neurons, and the unipolar neurons. Let's start with the multipolar neurons, since they are the most common type of neuron within the body. Now, the multipolar neurons have many, and when I say many, I mean hundreds of processes extending from the neuron soma or the cell body. Now, virtually all of these many hundreds of processes are dendrites, except of course for the one axon. And the axon typically in the multipolar neurons tends to be really long compared to the dendrites. Now, as I mentioned before, the multipolar neuron is the most common type of neuron in the body, and they are primarily located within the central nervous system. So this is the neuron type that makes up the bulk of the brain and spinal cord tissue. So multipolar neurons function in two ways, and we'll take a look at that on the left side of this table here. Now, multipolar neurons can function as interneurons, and interneurons are neurons that relay information within the central nervous system. These interneurons, which are also called integration neurons, essentially help to connect the sensory input function to the motor output functions of the nervous system. And so these interneurons serve in the interpretation and the processing of that sensory information. And then those interneurons typically communicate with motor neurons so that those motor neurons can then issue the commands to muscles or glands that will change what the body is doing in response to that particular stimulus. So most of the multipolar neurons function as interneurons or integration neurons, and some of these multipolar neurons function as motor neurons. That is, their somas and dendrites are found within the central nervous system, and they send a very long axon out to make synapses or junctions with effectors, that is, muscles and glands. And so some but not all of these multipolar neurons function as motor neurons that convey impulses or action potentials out of the central nervous system to effectors such as skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. Okay, so those are the multipolar neurons. Let's turn our attention to the bipolar neurons, which are in the center of our table 11.2 here. Now, bipolar neurons, as their name implies, bi means two, and so these neurons have two processes that extend from the soma. One process is a dendrite, which comes from the fusion of smaller dendrites at its end. So what you have are these small, very fine little dendrites that all fuse into one single dendrite and convey information towards the soma or the cell body of the neuron, which is generally located kind of centrally within between the dendrite and the axon. So at the other end of this neuron, emerging from the opposite end of the cell body or the soma, is the axon. So this type of neuron is actually pretty rare in the body, and there are fewer of this neuron type than any of the other neuron types, and they're mostly associated with special sensory organs. And so they're typically found in things like the olfactory sensory structures within the nose. So olfactory means smell, and so they're associated with the sensory structures that are in the nose that give us our sense of smell. And they're also associated with the sensory structures of our eyes and our ears as well. So because bipolar neurons are associated with special sensory structures, they function as sensory neurons that are conveying sensory information from those special sensory organs like the eye, the ear, and the nose to the central nervous system for interpretation. So last but not least, we have the third structural type of neuron, which is called the unipolar neuron. The book also refers to it as pseudo-unipolar neurons. So if you wanted to refer to it as, or if you wanted to refer to these neurons as pseudo-unipolar neurons as well, that is also correct. So you may do so as well. I just think unipolar is easier to remember than pseudo-unipolar. So the unipolar neurons have two processes. Kind of confusingly, they have two processes, even though uni usually means one. There are actually two processes. There is a peripheral process and a central process, which together form this very long axon. In the center, or typically near the center of the neuron, there's a small little branch of the cell that holds and contains the cell body. So it's kind of similar in shape to the bipolar neuron, but the cell body, rather than being kind of sandwiched between two processes, actually kind of sits on this little like stalk of this little stalk or this little branch off of the axon, rather than sitting between the dendrite and the axon directly. So we have a peripheral process and a central process, which together form the axon. So the peripheral process actually connects to the receptive endings, or the receptive regions of the neuron. The receptive endings essentially function as dendrites. So even though they're not called dendrites in this diagram here, they function as dendrites. So that is, they are detecting stimuli and they are creating graded potentials that will then trigger this axon to create, or I should say can trigger this axon to create an action potential. So the receptive endings function as dendrites here. The central process, which is at kind of the opposite end of the neuron here, is the second of the axon processes, and it ends at the axon terminals where neurotransmitters are released. So together the peripheral process and the central process form the centrally located axon in that particular neuron. So most of the unipolar neurons function as sensory neurons, and instead of carrying special sensory information like we saw with the bipolar neurons, unipolar neurons carry general sensory information from things like the skin, the skeletal muscles, the joints, and they carry all of this information, or convey all of this information, to the central nervous system for integration and interpretation.